It's my privilege to introduce to you my colleague from the Department of Religion, Professor Deborah Goodwin.
Thank you, Chuck. Notwithstanding Lawrence Krauss's energetic assertions to the contrary, I submit that we are now at a place with a speaker who will take us to the intersection of how the universe came to be and where and why it came to be, and what meaning we can attach to life's emergence. How we address the questions of where we came from, how and why, have profound implications for where we're heading and about how we ought to live in the meantime. We have come, of course, to the intersection of what we commonly call religion and science. While many of us are deeply intrigued by these two areas of study, recent surveys indicate that Americans are startlingly underinformed about each. Given the array of scientific and ethical issues that face us, Americans clearly need more and better tools with which to navigate the intersection of science and religion, to reconcile the conflict between supposedly hard data and soft values. Fortunately, our next speaker is well equipped to help us. George Coyne earned a Ph.D. in astronomy from Georgetown University after completing a bachelor's degree in mathematics at Fordham. His career as a scientist parallels his life as a Jesuit priest. Since its founding in the 16th century by Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuit order has been involved in higher education internationally. Since the 1920s, Jesuits have staffed the Vatican Observatory, which George Coyne directed from 1978 until 2006. He now holds the McDevitt Chair in Religious Philosophy at Moyne College in Syracuse, New York. Father Coyne exemplifies how to integrate the life of a working scientist with a life of faith. His career has been long, his research interests varied. He has published numerous scientific articles on topics ranging from the character of the moon's surface to studies that help us understand how stars are formed. One honor recognizing his contribution to science was the naming of an asteroid, now 14429 Coyne, in 1991. George Coyne has also contributed extensively to efforts promoting responsible dialogue between science and religion. In thought-provoking speeches, essays, and books, he's described how people of faith can come to terms with new discoveries about the universe's origins. He argues that the new evidence neither compels belief in God, nor does it conclusively deny the possibility for such a belief. In common with other scientists and theologians, he's noted that science and religion emerge from and speak to different aspects of human existence. Using the methods of one to evaluate the data of the other only leads to frustration, or a government shutdown, I suppose. Father Coyne approaches this relationship differently, as you may have guessed already. He starts, refreshingly, with the science. What does it tell us about the nature of the universe? What then does the nature of the universe, scientifically described, tell him about the God in whom he believes? The universe's qualities of dynamism, freedom, and fertility, as he calls the interaction between chance and necessity that led to life, cohere with his experience of God. This God is a loving parent who guides its children's development, but does not determine all its children's choices. In a phone conversation last week, I asked Father Coyne what he likes to read for pleasure. Some may recognize this as an interview question from Gustavus's presidential scholarship process. Mostly European or American history, he replied. Knowing that some of my physics colleagues read poetry for pleasure, I told him that his description of the fecundity of the universe as a reflection of God's love had reminded me of a poem. He knew instantly what I had in mind. It's by his fellow Jesuit, the 19th century English poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, and entitled the Virgin Mary compared to the air we breathe. I'll read a few lines so that you can share our mutual aha moment. Wild air, world-mothering air, nestling me everywhere, that each eyelash or hair girdles, that's fairly mixed with, riddles, and is rife in every least thing's life. This needful, never spent, and nursing element. Who this one work has to do, let all God's glory through. Do but stand where you can lift your hand skywards, rich, rich it laps round the 4 finger gaps. Be thou then, O thou dear mother, my atmosphere, my happier world. Stir in my ears, speak there of God's love, O live air, of patience, penance, prayer. World-mothering air, air wild, wound with thee, in thee isled, fold home, fast fold thy child. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues and guests, please welcome George Vincent Coyne, Ph.D., S.J.
Thank you very much. We'll see whether you applaud at the end. That's the test. Thank you very much, Deborah, because you've done a job for me already, which I will build upon. That is, you've changed directions a bit in what we've been doing. And that's what I'm going to do. Although the directions are not opposite to one another, I think there's a continuity. I think as you see as I go along, the direction will be somewhat different from the, let's call it, hard science that we've been doing. It's something like taking Tyra's magnet on the Large Hadron Collider and just making it several times bigger so that the protons go zooming around on that curve, not faster, but they curve around a lot more. So I'm going to be throwing a few curveballs as far as hard science goes. I'm actually going to, it's not a comfortable style for me, but I am going to read because the topic I'm treating is a minefield. And I prefer to know what mines I'm treading upon. I did, just the other day, go to the market and buy myself some Obama insurance so that I'm covered. And I'm keeping Lawrence Krauss in sight. And you'll see why. I did notice that Lawrence had a nice style of walking up and down, but he didn't hit any mines. If I did, I'm afraid I would. So let us begin. It is arguably difficult. I have a few little slides that will keep you kind of focused on what I'm doing. It is arguably difficult to find a more heated topic of discussion than that concerning the origins of the universe, and especially of life and intelligence, and whether such origins can be understood without evoking a creator God. Responses range from the extremes of some quantum cosmologist or a church leader to almost all conceivable intermediate positions. Some quantum cosmologists claim that if certain quantum cosmological theories of the origins of the universe without boundary conditions are correct, then we have no need of God. Pius XII, on the other hand, attempted to claim that with Big Bang cosmologies, scientists were coming to discover what had already been known from the book of Genesis, namely that the universe had a beginning in God's creative action. In between, we have such positions as evolutionary naturalism, episodic divine intervention. Evolutionary naturalists would claim that although our scientific knowledge of evolution is limited, the best explanation of the universe and all that it contains is through the building up of more complex entities in an expanding, evolving universe in which both deterministic and chance processes play out their roles in a universe abundant with opportunities, 13.8 billion years old and containing about 10 to the 22nd stars. You will note that most, if not all, of the science that I will very briefly go through here, you've already heard about, so I'm going to go through it very briefly for the purposes of this talk. Those who profess episodic divine intervention would claim that divine activity is required, at least in some phases of the evolutionary process, and in particular at the occurrence of human life and intelligence, because natural processes alone are not adequate to explain the end result. What is one who is both a believing Christian and a scientist to make of all this? I'm going to talk a little bit how do we search for truth in science in rather general terms. Okay. Skeptics, dubious of ever being able to find a widely accepted definition of science, say that science is what scientists do. The element of truth in this statement is that science is not a univocal concept. It varies from one discipline to another, even, for instance, among the so-called hard sciences. But there's also sufficient commonality among them that the name science can be legitimately given to each, but analogically, with differences. What do scientists do? We begin with controlled data, that is, data which any other trained professional could independently verify. From the observed data, we develop a model which best explains the data. We will later on discuss what constitutes a best explanation. There are many assumptions involved in the process of developing, for instance, our knowledge of the origin of the universe and of life within it. One of the principal assumptions is that it is valid to apply the scientific laws which are derived from our knowledge of what happens on Earth to the universe as a whole. At any rate, the movement from data to models is a continuously reciprocal process, a back and forth. We use the best model to determine what further data must be obtained. Then we perfect the model with the new data. There is a constant going back and forth from the data to the model to the data. It is important to note that in the very nature of this process of reciprocity, we admit that we do not possess the truth. The most that we can expect is that we are continually approaching the truth. How do we know we're on the path to the truth in the scenario for the origins of the universe and life within it? In the natural sciences, there are a number of criteria whereby an explanation is judged to be the best. We might list, this is not exhaustive, the principal criteria as the following. Verifiability or falsifiability, that is, that there is at least in principle a way of judging whether the explanation fits the data or not. 2, predictability. From the data on past or present events, it is possible to predict future events and then observe to see that the future events actually occur. Simplicity or economy. That is, we make the least assumptions to get the greatest explanatory power. Beauty, that's come up in several of the talks. That is, the explanation, the scientific explanation, has an aesthetic quality to it. Although, especially for the natural sciences, this may appear to be a subjective criteria, almost all great scientific discoveries have benefited from its application. Unifying explanatory power as a criterion for best scientific explanation. Not only are the observations at hand explained, but the attempt to understand is also in harmony with all else that we know, even with that which we know outside the natural sciences. It is this last criterion which I would like to discuss in a bit more detail, since it appears to me to extend the semantics of the natural sciences toward the realm of other disciplines, and especially in the case I am discussing, in the limited discussion of this paper, to Christian faith, and I'll get into that. Put in very simple terms, this criterion is nothing else than a call for the unification of our knowledge. One could hardly be opposed to that, although I'm waiting. The problem arises with the application of this criterion. When is the unification not truly unifying, but rather an adulteration of knowledge obtained by one discipline with presuppositions inherent in another discipline? History is obviously full of such adulterations. It is for this reason that scientists have always hesitated to make use of this criterion. And yet, to my mind, if applied cautiously, it appears to me to be a quite creative one for the advancement of knowledge and therefore of religious faith. To what extent can what we know from science about the origins of the universe and the evolution of life within the universe influence our religious beliefs? And on the other hand, to what extent can religious thought make a contribution to our scientific understanding of the origins and evolution of the universe? This twofold question poses the serious risk of transgressing upon the epistemological independence of the various disciplines: theology, philosophy, astrophysics, biology, cosmology, and creating thereby more confusion than understanding. As this discussion proceeds, we must maintain a consistent posture of preserving the integrity of each of the disciplines, especially between cosmology and theology. History has already shown how disastrous an effect the failure to preserve the integrity of the respective disciplines has had. The supposition here, I repeat, is that there is a universal basis for our understanding, and since the basis cannot be self-contradictory, the understanding we have from one discipline should complement that which we have from all other disciplines. One is most faithful to one's own discipline, be it the natural sciences, social sciences, philosophy, literature, religious thought, if one accepts this universal basis. This means in practice that while remaining faithful to the strict criteria of one's own discipline, we are open to accepting the truth value of the conclusions of other disciplines. And this acceptance must not only be passive, but in a sense we must also be active in seeking this unification, in the sense that we integrate those conclusions in conclusions derived from all other disciplines. This, of course, does not mean that there will be no conflict, even contradictions, between conclusions reached by various disciplines. But if one truly accepts, and you need not, but if one truly accepts the universal basis for our knowledge that I have spoken of, then those conflicts and contradictions must be seen as temporary and apparent. They themselves can serve as a spur to further knowledge, since the attempt to resolve the differences will undoubtedly bring us to a richer, unified understanding. The search for truth involves, in a very real sense, in the sciences, the putting of the universe into our heads through all the disciplines. So we use mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology to put the universe in our heads and try and understand it. So as you know very well, we know the mass of this galaxy, we know how fast it's rotating, we know how many young stars are in it, how many old stars are in it, and for the past 2 days we've been through doing precisely this in much more serious issues than simply understanding this galaxy. We've been trying to understand the universe. But I am not a walking brain. This is not the only part of my human experiences. There's some music I like. There's some music I don't like. There are some people I like. There's some people, there are none here, of course, that I don't like. The totality of our human experiences cannot be captured through modern science and putting the universe in our heads. The totality of our experience. At least that's the point I wish to make by showing this slide. What, therefore, is the search for truth in religious belief? I've tried to give a very brief survey of what it is in science. Too often discussions of the relationship between science and religion are carried out in very general terms. Such discourse can be quite unfruitful for 2 reasons. First, as compared to the natural sciences, religion contains a large measure of the subjective, of human experiences not totally verifiable by objective reasons. Such subjective experiences are not, of course, limited to religion. They are present in many areas of our lives. Nor indeed these experiences, religious or otherwise, need they necessarily conflict with reason. They simply are not limited to rational explanation. They go beyond what we can rationally justify. Secondly, while for the natural sciences, as we've just seen, we have a rather acceptable idea of what we mean by science, the very notion of religion is ill-defined. Does it mean worship? Does it mean being a good person? Does it mean accepting certain moral dictates that go beyond what is commonly accepted as good and bad? Does it mean accepting those dictates out of personal conviction or out of loyalty to a certain tradition? Does it mean believing in certain doctrines? Does it mean accepting a certain authoritative and hierarchical structure, being affiliated with a certain church? To most of us, I can't speak for all of you, but I would hazard the guess that to most of us, religion, whether we're religious or not, would imply more of an affirmative than a negative answer to all of the above. And yet the situation is further complicated by the multiplicity of religions which differ among themselves, having even warred among themselves over the responses given to the questions I just listed. Even today, if we look at some of the main religious traditions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, etc., we see not only vast differences among them, but enormous divisions within any one of those traditions. The only way, therefore, that a dialogue as a rational experience can take place is that on the part of religion, the dialogue be limited to the rational foundations for religious belief. Even then, the only way that any such dialogue could have universal significance is that we could assume that there existed a common rational foundation across all religious traditions, and that simply is not the case. It seems, therefore, that any fruitful dialogue requires that the rational basis for certain specific religious beliefs in certain specific religious traditions be confronted with what is known from the natural sciences. The natural sciences in particular have made great advances by adhering rigidly to canons of what is scientifically true. In fact, as is well understood after these few days, in recent years, the norms for judging the scientific truth of a given theory of life's origins and evolution have been extended, as I have just discussed, in the direction of inviting dialogue with philosophy and theology, and specifically within the realm of Christianity for reasons I have just mentioned. The best scientists, and they're here with us, are usually well aware, and they've expressed it, of the limitations of their knowledge. Religious thinking also has its limitations. The excessively dogmatic approach, which sometimes characterizes theology, would do well to recognize that as it seeks for understanding which truly nourishes Christian faith, it does not possess the truth. Theology must deal with linguistic interpretation of written documents. It must interpret oral traditions. It must reconstruct history. It must establish a rational basis for accepting witnesses to historical events. And it must determine when authority alone can be the source of certain truths. Above all, there are the serious epistemological problems that arise from the relationship of theology to faith. Although theology is a science in the broad sense of the word, a rational search for understanding, it is said to proceed from faith and lead to an understanding of faith. This makes it subject to all of the false illusions that can arise from purely subjective behavior, and it must always struggle to separate those illusions from what is objectively true. It must, above all, in today's world, confront our scientific knowledge of the origins of the universe and of the evolution of life. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Creator is a conscious and loving person. The religious believer is tempted by science, however, to make God explanation. And I referred to this earlier today in a little panel discussion. We try to bring God in to explain things that we cannot otherwise explain. How did the universe begin? How did we come to be? We seize upon God, especially if we do not feel that we have good and reasonable scientific answers to such questions. We seize upon God. She is brought in. By the way, I not apologize. I simply declare, rather than twist my tongue around, I'm going to refer to God as she. I can't say it, because I just said it's a person. So God is a she for purposes of getting through this talk. True belief in God does not come about by proving God's existence through anything like a scientific process. God is not found as the conclusion of a rational process like that. It's not church, but here I go. God gave himself to us. That was not a miracle. It does make sense that there is a personal God who deals with us, loves us, and has given himself to us. Faith consists in coming to love God in return because we have accepted the fact that she first made the move towards us. The claim that all things are created is a religious claim, that all that exists depends for its existence on God. It says nothing, and nothing is going to come up time and time again It says nothing scientifically about how things came to be. Although beautiful stories are told, for instance, in the book of Genesis, to elaborate upon the dependence of all things for their existence upon God. Not going to go into that very much. Stories, I said, in Genesis, and stories tell a truth. If they're good stories, they tell marvelous truths, but not scientific truths. So to introduce another character into this, there she is. This is a picture I'm going to rely upon quite a bit. Did God do it? Here is a beautiful design of God doing it. And I'm afraid God went to a lot of trouble of designing things, but she did a damn poor job. If you take God as a designer, you're in trouble. Hurricanes, tornadoes, leukemia. Let's now go with this very brief treatment of, scientific methods and the search for truth in religious belief. Let's go to what I call the possible interaction, according to what I've said already, of scientific cosmology and Christian faith. One of the most productive areas, obviously, of research in modern cosmology, this you need not be told, but it's in my script, is the application of quantum mechanics to an analysis of the origins and very earliest state of the universe. It is important to note that our observational knowledge of those early stages of the universe, observational knowledge, is very limited. But we can argue back quite rigorously, as has been done during these days, to the physical conditions which characterize those stages by applying physics and mathematics to what we observe in the universe today, to what the universe was at its origins. Amidst the myriads of such observational data, and this is a quick flash because you've already seen this any number of times, but I did want to just review. There are three principal areas that indicate very well the whole discussion of Big Bang cosmologies, expanding universe, and everything in it. And they are from measurements, as you've seen, of distant galaxies. We reconstruct from the velocity of recession of those galaxies. It's been discussed in detail. We come to an expanding, evolving also universe. And then from measurements of the cosmic background radiation, we get an idea of when the universe became transparent and how structure began to develop in the universe. From those three types of observations, which you've heard about in detail during the past few days, we can come to an understanding of the early universe and how we came to be in a universe the way it is today from that early universe. When we combine all of this and other observations, we can determine the age of the universe, its approximate mass, its mean density, and all such fundamental physical characteristics of the universe. The summary of the results of modern cosmology represents an amazing feat, obviously an amazing feat, in the combination of our knowledge of elementary particle physics and observational astrophysics. But the nagging questions remain. How did it all begin? When it began, were there not certain initial conditions which determined how it would be today? Did the universe really come to be in all its specificity from quantum fluctuations at its origin? Such considerations also suffer from problems of verifiability, but they've been addressed during the past few days, so I'm not going to go into that. The question also arises as to whether they really provide ultimate explanations. Don't ask me to define the word ultimate, at least at this time. Okay? It is precisely here, I believe, that the semantics of science and Christian faith might fruitfully interact. Many of the concepts which are essential ingredients in cosmological models have important implications in religious thought, and those implications must also enrich cosmological thinking, so that the latter may have the greatest unifying explanatory power, a criterion for its veracity. In exploring these implications, however, it is essential that the fundamental significance of the concepts in the various disciplines not be confused. On the other hand, the precise thrust of interdisciplinary dialogue is that a wider perspective will be gained on the fundamental reality by interrelating the concepts arising from the diverse disciplines. In most of hot Big Bang cosmological models, the universe had a beginning, in most. The beginning at time equals 0 is a mathematical singularity. It cannot be addressed by classical mathematics or physics. To avoid that singularity, it is claimed that quantum gravity must be applied at the extreme conditions of the universe's beginning. You just heard this from Lawrence. During this quantum gravity regime, however, the concept of time is inapplicable in any simple way. Most approaches require an origin of our specific universe from quantum fluctuations of a previous state, or a collapsing previous state, a region of flat space-time, a previous black hole final state. Such approaches, which Lawrence addressed in quite detail, such approaches exist, therefore only address relative beginnings. They still leave us wondering about the origins of the previous state upon which the quantum fluctuations played out their game. What, if anything, do these quantum gravity considerations of the origin of the universe have to do, for instance, with the religious considerations of the creation of the universe from nothing? Creatio ex nihilo is the crisp Latin expression of this. Any attempt to identify the nothing, and I have not said that anybody did this, but any attempt to simply identify the nothing of the religious thinker with the quantum fluctuations of one of the pre-existing states would, to my mind, create nothing but confusion. But the one concept may illuminate the other. The thrust of from nothing for the religious thinker is simply to assert the total and exclusive dependence of the universe upon God the Creator. There was no rival God pre-existing before the universe began, and in its beginning and its continuation, it depends upon God. Period. That is the theological idea of creation from nothing. I cannot see how the scientific concepts deny or challenge the religious ones, and they may even be illuminated by them. It would be equally confusing to deny the existence of God by stating that since no boundary conditions were required for the quantum cosmological order in the universe, God is not required. The God of the religious person is not a boundary condition for the universe. She is the creator. Whether that content contains anything other than nothing, I cannot say. Creator, period. The key to understanding the difference between creation and origins is the notion of change. Changes in nature are the object of the study for the natural sciences. from pure energy to matter, from hydrogen to hydrocarbons, from giant molecular clouds to star clusters, from single cells to organs, from amino acids to the human brain. These are all objects of investigation for the natural sciences. They all require an existing entity which changes. The natural sciences do not deal with the issue of existing at all. They deal with existing in a specific way and the changes in nature which bring about specific ways of existing. Creation, on the other hand, speaks to the very existence of whatever exists. It does not speak to change. Creation does not deal with the chain of events which bring about a specific kind of being. It deals with the source of being of whatever exists. It does not address the evolution of one kind of being from another. To create, therefore, is not to work on or with something already existing material. Creation, therefore, is not a cause in the usual sense of the word. Or if you wish, creation is the complete cause of all things. Such a complete causing is precisely what the act of creation is. Thus, to create is to give existence to whatever exists in a specific way. To create does not mean to take nothing and make something of it, in the sense of changing it from non-being to being. To exist means to depend upon a source of existence. So creation is not exclusively or even primarily some distant event. To create is the continual, complete causing of existence for whatever exists. So there can, in principle, I repeat to my mind, be no necessary conflict between the doctrine of creation in theology and any scientific explanation of origins. The natural sciences seek to account for change and the origins of change. Whether the changes described are biological or cosmological, have a beginning or not, are unending or temporally finite, they remain processes of change. Creation accounts for the existence of things, not for changes in things. So given that something exists, how life originated from this something is a scientific question. Whether there is something rather than nothing is not a scientific question. And we're obviously going to have to face some discussion of that declaration. Religious perceptions of beginning speak of creating out of nothing, as we've been talking about. There is a persistent confusion, and it is persistent, between cosmological and metaphysical religious conceptions of nothing. Quantum cosmological views of the beginning of the universe speak, as we have just seen, of vacuum fluctuations. And some are tempted to equate this vacuum with the nothing of the theologians. This is quite incorrect. The vacuum of quantum mechanics is something, if only a mathematical concept. To speak of creation out of nothing in philosophy or theology means that one is denying that any matter at all is changed or transformed into something else. The expression out of nothing or from nothing is at its root a denial of any material cause whatsoever in the act of creation. In our discourse on beginnings, we find it necessary to speak in a temporal framework, although that was discussed a bit as to how necessary that is, but let me assume it is. The creator is considered to be prior to what is created, but the priority is in fact not in time. The relationship is metaphysical, not temporal. We use the word before, but in a metaphysical sense, not in a temporal sense. To be created out of nothing does not mean that the creature is first nothing and then something. It means that the creature has a dependent existence. Ancient philosophers of nature thought that the universe was eternal in the sense that it had no beginning. Some cosmologists propose that the very notion of temporality is a subsidiary concept. Neither view challenges the fundamental metaphysical truth that the universe is created. Some also propose that there is eternal inflation, as we have talked about, an endless series of universes within universes. Still, all such universes would require creation in order to be. Nor is there a contradiction in the notion of an eternal created universe. For even if the universe had no temporal beginning, it still would depend upon a creator for its very being. The radical dependence on a fundamental source of being as the cause, in quotes, of being is what creation means. I can't help, but I'm sure most of you have heard this, but I like it so much I'm going to tell it. As far as time goes, St. Augustine was asked, and he studied time in the 3rd, 4th century, not as we do today, but he was one of the first to establish time as a measure of periodic motion, etc. And when he was said, if you don't ask me what time is, I know perfectly well. But if you ask me, I do not know. He was also asked one time what God was doing before he created the universe. And he thought for a little bit, and he said, before God created the universe, he was creating hell for people that ask questions like that. Let me approach a slightly different topic, which really doesn't fit into the title of my talk, but I think it follows upon it, and I'm going to do it anyway. If we were to pursue the dialogue which I have outlined in this paper, we might soon come to see that a teleology that is kind of a going towards an end and a design in the universe derived from a religious point of view are not incompatible with our scientific knowledge of life's origins and evolution. Or we would come to realize that inevitable tendency in the physical universe towards more complex structures is an invitation to think beyond science to a deeper synthesis of our understanding of scientific evolution and therefore of our Christian faith. The important thing to realize is that both the scientific and the religious approaches to understanding, in both of them we are searching for the truth, as I have reviewed. We do not possess the truth. But it is clear that evolution is an intrinsic and proper characteristic of the universe. Neither the universe as a whole nor any of its ingredients can be understood except in terms of evolution. And evolution is a daily happening. We, for instance, as was mentioned earlier, are constantly exchanging atoms with the total reservoir of atoms in the universe. Each year, 98% of the atoms in our bodies are renewed. You can call me by the same name, but my atoms are not the same. Each time we breathe, we take in billions and billions of atoms recycled by the rest of breathing organisms during the past few weeks. That's why it's suggested to get flu shots. Nothing in my genes was present a year ago. It is all new, regenerated from available energy and matter in the universe. My skin is renewed each month and my liver each 6 weeks. So I'm going to have another gin and tonic tonight. In brief, human beings are among the most recycled living beings in the universe. How are we to interpret the picture of life's origins in terms of religious belief? Does our knowledge of scientific evolution affect the semantics of Christian faith? It would be a mistake, I think, to require a belief in God to provide a scientific explanation of origins and evolution. In fact, to need God, as we have already said, would be a very denial of God. God is not the response to a need. One gets the impression, as I mentioned earlier today, from certain religious believers that they fondly hope for the durability of certain gaps in our scientific knowledge so that they can fill them with God. This is the exact opposite of what human intelligence is all about. We should be seeking for the fullness of God in creation if we're religious believers. We should not need God. We should accept her when she comes. It is unfortunate that creationism has come to mean some fundamentalist, literal, scientific interpretation of Genesis. Judeo-Christian faith is radically creationist, but in a totally different sense. It is rooted in the belief that I have just tried to explain, that everything depends upon God, or better, is a gift of God. The universe is not God. It cannot exist independently of God. Neither pantheism nor naturalism are true. But if we confront what we know of origins scientifically with religious faith in God the Creator, in the senses that I've described above, I would claim that the detailed scientific understanding of origins has no bearing whatsoever on whether God exists or not. It has a great deal to do with my knowledge of God, should I happen to believe that she exists. Our scientific knowledge of evolution should definitely have a bearing on the semantics of Christian faith. Let me briefly explain. Two rather extreme scientific views of origins, those of Stephen Jay Gould of an episodic, totally contingent, and therefore non-repeatable evolutionary process, as contrasted to a convergent evolutionary process, such as that of Christian de Duve and others, in which the interplay of chance, necessity, and opportunity leads inevitably to life and intelligence. In either case, it is scientifically tenable to maintain an autonomy and self-sufficiency of the natural processes in the natural world, so that recourse to God to explain the origin of all that exists is not required. It is not a question of chance in nature excludes God. Destiny in nature requires God. In neither case is God required. If, however, I believe in God, despite the fact that I'm a Jesuit, I do believe in God, then what nature tells me about God in one case is very different from what nature tells me about God in the other. Please note that I'm not calling upon faith to adjudicate between contrasting scientific viewpoints. I do think that convergent evolution is more consistent with God's revelation of herself in the book of Scripture, so that, as Galileo was fond of saying, the book of Scripture and the book of nature speak of the same God. If we take the results of modern science seriously, and we do, most of us, it is difficult to believe that God is all-powerful and all-knowing in the sense of the scholastic philosophers. Science tells us, if it speaks at all, speaking of the universe, if we bring in God, must be a God who is very different from God as seen by the medieval philosophers and theologians. Let me take for instance, the God I believe in, for instance, after 1 billion years in this 14 billion year old universe that we've been talking about, could God, after 1 billion years, let's say, from the Big Bang, have predicted that human life would come to be? Let us suppose that God knew all the laws of biology, chemistry, physics, initial conditions, all the fundamental forces. Even then, God could not know with certainty that human life would come to be. If we truly accept the scientific view that in addition to the necessary processes and the immense opportunities offered by the fertile universe, there are also chance processes, then it would appear that not even God could know the outcome with certainty. God cannot know what is not knowable. The theologian, of course, would have a different answer. God is transcendent, outside of space and time. All events are simultaneous to her. But I have wished to stress God's immanence in a universe where our scientific knowledge of the origins of life must have a bearing upon the semantics of our Christian faith. All that I've talked about provide from science very weak images of viewing God. We can only come to know God by analogy. That is, from what we know here, we apply it to God, but it does not completely apply to God. So when we say God is like this, we have to say God is not like this. We can only come to God by this process. The universe as we know it today through science is one way to derive an analogical knowledge of God. For those who accept that modern science does say something to us about God, it provides a challenge, an enriching challenge to traditional beliefs about God. In his infinite wisdom, God continuously creates a world which reflects that freedom, the freedom of God at all levels in the evolutionary process to greater and greater complexity. God lets the world be what it will be in its continuous evolution. She does not intervene, but rather allows, participates, loves. Is such thinking adequate to preserve the special character attributed by religious thought to the emergence not only of life, but also of spirit, while avoiding a crude creationism? I don't know. And if I did, it's a long way from Rome, I probably would not say. But I think only a protracted dialogue will tell. My important statement at the end is the following. If there is any truth to the emergence of life in the universe, of human life in the universe, isn't there a way, though science cannot find this, that the spirit, the spiritual dimension of the human being emerged at a certain time without being reduced to the previous state of material? That's an open question, but I think it's one that theologians, knowing a bit of science, should address. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Coyne, for that spirited talk. I'd like to call our panelists up to the front to begin our last Q&A session for the day. And I ask you to submit your questions to the ushers at this time.
It's the nothing, isn't it? The nothing. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take your seats, we'll begin the Q&A session in just a few seconds. You just said that you really agree exactly with my position. So you keep shifting. You keep shifting. You keep... Do you want to start? Oh, all right. We, as always, we begin with questions from the panel, and I think Professor Krauss has a question.
There's a lot of sense in some of the things you said, I think.
Thank you.
And you know that I have great respect for you, and we've worked together to try and improve the world, I think, and for which I thank you. Let me just ask I think you made a really important point that your belief in God is a belief, and that creation is independent of all the discussions we've had about origins and development and everything else. So I guess I have two questions, I suppose, which is why does there have to be creation? Or, I mean, let me do both questions. Why is creation necessary in the sense of yours? Why is there any creation? In that sense, for example, what's the difference between the multiverse and God? And the second question is, what does God add to anything we've talked about? What does it add to anything if it's so remote from our understanding of everything that this belief in a vague God which seems very different than your belief in a Christian God, a God who actually comes down to earth in some form and actually intervenes. I don't see the connection between those things. So I guess the God that you've discussed doesn't seem to add anything to anything. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
You answered the first question yourself earlier today, I think. And what was it again?
Why is creation necessary?
It's a philosophical issue, that everything we know comes and goes, exists, doesn't exist, is born, dies, everything. There's nothing necessary. Everything's contingent, dependent. And so you mentioned it's Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, essentially.
So
if you accept them, they're reasonable.
Well,
you come to a philosopher's God, I call it, a philosopher's God. A God of the scholastic way of doing, it's rational.
But everything's contingent except God. So
That's
by
right.
definition.
That's right.
Well, that's just a definition then, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Let me expand on that a little bit.
Oh.
Again, putting aside a spiritual God or a traditionally Christian God who appears in 3 forms and all that, the God that you're invoking as a creator of this universe, looking at it from a purely intellectual perspective, and again, I'm not denigrating anyone's beliefs or anything, but from a purely intellectual perspective, I find that I must ask who created or what created that God.
Yeah.
And so then it becomes the infinite regress argument from a purely intellectual perspective, not from a spiritual one, okay?
Yeah, so that's a follow-up on what Lawrence just said,
Yeah.
Alex. It's,
Exactly.
There has to be a first being.
Why?
to explain
Why not the
any-
laws of physics in that case?
Well,
Why not? Yeah. Why does there have to be?
I'm not a
what do we know that-
okay, I'm going to sort of
Yeah.
lop this around a bit. I'm not a philosopher, but there's a long tradition in philosophy that argues to the necessary existence of a necessary eternal being in order to explain any being. Now you ask me why I can't go beyond that. That's the ultimate of an intellectual quest. Now whether you accept it or not, I suppose depends on your, not your intellect, your intellectual quest.
But to say that there has to be because this is what we know, of course, goes against everything you've done as a scientist. What we know does not imply what has to be. And to make the assumption that what's familiar to us on the basis of what we've experienced is the way everything must be, of course, goes against the grain of the whole history of science. And I'm surprised to hear you say it in some sense.
No, first of all, I didn't say that. That I argued from, I'm not saying that has to be or not has to be is not the question. I'm not working on Shakespeare here, but it's whatever exists is dependent.
On what?
On the first being.
Why?
It's not that it could be.
I mean, there wasn't a first human. There was no first human.
Because humans are dependent beings.
But in some sense, the assumption of dependence is an assumption, right? It's not a law. It assumes causality, for example, among other things.
Okay, let me pick up on that. That it's an assumption. I'll accept that it's an assumption. But it's an assumption that does not contradict at least my rational processes. It does not contradict them.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree with you there. It's just an assumption without any evidence and in fact, without any support based on everything we know, as far as I can see.
Without any support on everything we know.
Everything we know, but no empirically.
All empirical knowledge.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And would you agree with that?
I think I would if you really insist on or accept the empirical character of it. Because all that I know goes beyond, all that I know rationally goes beyond the empirical.
Okay, and let me ask one other question. The vague creator, which I would completely agree science could never address, unless, as I say, you can have positive evidence. If the skies aligned tonight and I looked up and they realigned and said in Aramaic, "I am here" or something, then but the absence of it can't say anything about that. But would you agree that those claims you've made about a vague creator related to quantum cosmology absolutely have no logical connection to the specific religious doctrine that your organization espouses, namely Jesus, a person or something who intervened and all of those doctrinal aspects. So there's no connection between that vague philosophical creator that science can never describe and the doctrines of the world's religions, which science can say are generally wrong.
No, let me back up on you. You've jumped across the big bridge from this philosopher God, I called it, to the God of religious faith. Okay.
That's a big jump.
Okay. The God of religious faith is a God in the Judeo-Christian tradition who spoke to us, okay, through the ancient prophets, through Scripture, through church tradition. That's a religious faith. That does not contradict anything I know from science or from any other rational process. I could not come to it certainly by science or a rational process. But once I accept it, it does not conflict with any rational process. And as I tried to say towards the end, if I am a religious believer, if I accept that, then the science I know can help enrich my religious faith, that God did not make a washing machine. God did not make a car. He made a universe that I know as a scientist is very dynamic, forward-looking.
Oh, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. If you believe in God, then, and if you're a scientist, as Galileo and you, and I put you in a noble tradition.
Well, you put me in pretty good company.
Yeah, I like to think you're in that company. I do admire you. But in that sense, you're right. If you believe, then obviously as a scientist, you must think everything you learn about the universe reflects that being. But you sidestepped what I think is a question, and it may sound rude to ask it again, but I'll ask it.
Please.
That you argued that the Creator spoke to us through the Scriptures and through the prophets, and then you read the Scriptures, and they're full of nonsense. I mean, they're full of Jonah and the whale, homosexuals being bad, all of that stuff. It's nonsense.
You know, can we have another conference on
Oh, there you go.
I'm afraid that you simply misunderstand what Scripture is. And it's
Well, if you're saying that, you know, it's just written and it really reflects the human's interpretation at the time of God speaking to
Scripture
them.
was written over a period of the tradition is 5,000 years before Christ, but the earliest books 2,000 years before Christ until 150 years after Christ, by myriads of different authors in different cultures, reflecting the culture of that time.
Sure.
Okay? So the culture of that time that, you know, did not accept homosexuality or
So it was
talked
written by
about
humans
the
then.
sun moving and all of that.
So it's Scripture's written by humans and not God.
Both. But don't ask me how.
Okay.
Okay.
It was inspired by God.
Oh, okay.
I mean, we're going to have to take a course together.
Yeah, well, I'd love to. I enjoy you talking.
Any other questions from the
I
panel?
mean, I would just chime in on that because my experience with talking to theologians in Rome, the Catholic Church, they actually have thought about these questions very carefully, and they have reached conclusions and positions which I don't think are reflected in almost any religions. They're just there's just the class of people who are the people that you would call seekers of truth. It seemed to me, when I looked in the church, I saw that there were two broad camps. There were those who were in the business of saving souls and comforting people, right? Where the Pope is trying to steer them to comforting people more now than so forth. And there were those who were seeking what they thought was a theological truth, you know, positions that really reflected what they thought was the basis of the religion and the basis of a coherent way of thinking. And their idea of souls and their idea of the Creator and so forth were very different from what was being preached in the churches, right?
Perhaps it's a very naive idea, but I also think there's just two different ways of trying to make sense of the world and the universe. And science has a particular method, which is testable, and beyond the test is the hypotheses to test. But it's not in conflict with what you've been talking about, I think, unless I know you may disagree.
I'd like
but
to.
I
I'd like
think-
to. Okay. Well, go ahead.
Okay, then you can disagree with me, Frank. I think that in principle that's absolutely right, but in practice it's not. It's unfair. The reason, look, I don't care about religion. I care about science, and I think I want to interest people in the wonders of the universe. But I don't think it's fair to say that things are not in conflict when they have been. There are two different ways of knowing things. Everyone says that. It sounds good. Even Stephen Jay Gould said it. But science makes predictions. Those predictions work. The way, if you look historically, at least at the world's religions, and not the vague notion of a purposeful creator and these philosophical gods, but if you look at the world's religions, their ways of knowing things, if you look at empirical evidence, has generally been wrong. And when it disagrees with empirical evidence, then they are in conflict. And the claim that homosexuality is unnatural is in conflict. There are lots of conflict. This claim that you blow a horn and the sun stops moving in the sky when in fact it's moving in the sky because the earth is going around, not because the sun is going around, that's in conflict. So I think it's unfair to say, and that's where I come from. I think it's unfair to, I don't want to argue against purpose, because how could I know if there is or not? But I do think it's unfair to say that there isn't conflict in certain claims, which are after all scientific claims, that are made by the world's religions with science. And when those conflicts arise, I think we have to be upfront as scientists in spite of the fact that we might offend some people.
There's a basic assumption that you have that religion is a way of knowing, and it's not.
Well, that's fascinating, because so many theologians have told me religion is a way of knowing.
No, it's not.
It's a way of believing, if you ask me. I mean, but I don't.
Yeah?
Yeah. Well, I don't know what.
I mean, I'd have to back up and retract a little bit of that, but I would insist religion is not a way of knowing. And when it's judged as such, it's judged poorly, as you've just done. You're absolutely correct in your judgment upon religion as a way of knowing about homosexuality, how the sun and the earth are moving, how the world was created. God made the world in 6 days, got so tired he had to rest on the seventh, and he made light on the first day.
Fundamentalists do believe precisely those things in a very literal way.
First of all, it's a question of analyzing rationally, using, in the wide sense, scientific tools to understand the two Genesis stories. There are two different Genesis stories which contradict one another in small points as to what God did on what day, but that's fine. They're written by two different authors at different times. But God made light on the first day, okay? Let me go at that as a scientist. Okay, the sun and the stars in Genesis came to be on the fourth day. Where the hell was the light on the first day? So I'm a scientist. Well, I've been told by a scientist that that was the cosmic background radiation. Now, you can only go so far with this. You know, you can laugh a few times and all, but unfortunately, the approach to Scripture, and we've just talked about Genesis, but this carries through with all kinds of different forms in Scripture. If you accept what Scripture is, okay, then it's telling a truth. What Genesis is telling is what those people believed, the ancient Jewish people who were God's chosen people, for whatever reasons. Let's accept that. They were delivered by God from slavery into the land of milk and honey. They had plenty of time to think. They looked up and said, this vast universe, the God who made this must be the same God who has loved us. And so they told a story about it.
But do you think that when you say it's not a way of knowing, do you then agree the next step, which we would then agree, but I doubt we will, that it's also therefore not a way of knowing not only about how the universe works, but how we're supposed to behave? I don't think it's a way of knowing about that either.
No, it's not.
Oh, good. We agree. Okay. Good. Then
It's not a way of knowing. It is not a way of establishing your morality, of knowing how to believe. Other than in the broad sense of God said you have to love me and all that. That's telling them they have to do something.
Oh, but why do I have to love God?
Because he's God.
If he's God, George, if you were God, you wouldn't require me to love you.
Oh, I would. I'm not even God, and I require you.
Well, I do love you. And you know what? And you know what? I do, so it's okay.
I don't know where this is going.
Well, I think we've just seen an example of something that I think Einstein would agree with. Einstein said very many contradictory things about the notion of a creator. And I think, but he also said things about physicists. And one of them is that we're poor philosophers, which I suspect implies we're probably very poor theologians. So I think both sides of the debate need to tread very carefully in having this discussion. That's my personal beliefs.
Yep.
Can I? In the spirit of the following remarks, I'm going to, I think, agree with everybody and also disagree with everybody, with the possible exception of Tara, who I think I agree with all. I'm very, and I think we're very close to this. Bohr, another great hero of physics, had a concept which I think is quite profound and in some sense is demonstrably true in quantum mechanics. It's called complementarity. It's that there can be different ways of describing a situation that are each valid in their own terms, but seem to be mutually contradictory. For instance, you can describe particles entirely in terms of positions or entirely in terms of their momenta, but you can't do both at the same time. And I think that applies uncontroversially, or should be uncontroversially, to many situations. For instance, when we describe a human being, there is a physical description in terms of atoms and quarks and gluons and so forth, which is undoubtedly correct, but it's not necessarily the most useful description. And there's also a description, a rough and ready description in terms of personality that we use in everyday life and coherent behavior that is also valid, even though we don't really know how to reconcile those two descriptions, and that brings in issues of free will and, at the very least, a lot of ignorance. And I found when I start thinking about the world and how I understand it, many instances of complementarity, that there are different ways of describing the same objects or the same situations that seem to be mutually contradictory and may even be mutually contradictory, but each valid in their own terms. And perhaps that also applies to different ways of regarding the whole universe. So that said, and I had one other remark, which I think is also will please Lawrence.
Uh-oh.
I do think, however, it has to be said that regarded as scientific documents, the scriptures of any religion that I know of are not impressive.
There is zero. There is zero science in the scriptures.
Well, no, I would say it's more. It's not zero. It's negative.
Exactly. There are scientific claims that are wrong. It's not as if they don't make any scientific claims. They make scientific claims, and they're I don't know. You could say universally wrong. I mean, the universe appears to have a beginning, but they're generally wrong.
Have there been any scientists who made claims that are scientifically wrong?
Sure. Many.
Sure. Of course. All the time.
But the difference is, we all have, but the difference is no one claims that they're absolutely true.
Well,
at the same time as being wrong.
Right.
That's a huge
the
difference
process
in
of
science and religion.
Yeah.
well, not in my religious tradition.
Yeah, not in yours, I agree.
Well, as I tried to say in my talk, religion is a really catchy word.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to expand on this because I want to create more trouble. And that, but Frank reminded me of a problem I've been puzzling on every now and then. So the issue of free will is something that actually impinges on science in an indirect and a direct way. But we've had this problem in quantum mechanics for a very long time, that we somehow set our apparatus up, particularly the observer,
yes,
in the classical world with free will, and then we have the quantum mechanics and so forth, and we have people go off the deep end about quantum mechanics every time. But if you're going to have free will, it must have really serious implications about the true nature of quantum mechanics, that when you're trying to do your mini worlds or whatever it is, it's not like everyone can happen. There has to be a free will choice at each. I mean, the universe has to have the freedom to make a choice that doesn't depend on the past history, because the observer has a choice of how he sets up the experiment and observes it.
Well,
and so if you've got a person with free will, then you've got a universe with no hidden variables. Quantum mechanics, that's a true solid kind of a thing.
yes, but
Yeah, but George,
So there's definitely an impingement there between religion, humans, and
there's a relation
science,
for
yeah.
sure, but you have to distinguish free will from indeterminism, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think free will is a very good candidate for complementarity. I think it really is a concept that's obviously very important in the law and in psychology, but I think if you try to derive it from the laws of physics, you're going to be disappointed.
Well,
I agree.
trying to go the other way. I was trying to
another
say
place-
free will implied something about the laws of physics, and then you see if the laws of physics end up being consistent.
And let us not forget, I think I may have learned this from Frank, who this suggestion, and I just agree completely with what he said, but let us not forget, and people who like to use quantum mechanics as their argument, that quantum mechanics is a deterministic theory. It's second-order differential equations with initial boundary conditions where everything is determined. The wave function is completely determined. Now, how that is implemented in the real world is obviously a complex, detailed issue, but the theory is completely deterministic. It's not indeterministic at all.
But you do have branches
Yes.
There is
That's-
there is a choice being made periodically. Yes.
I think
but those branches would seem to be random if it were just quantum mechanical, and I could decide to bop myself on the head, but usually I don't decide to do that. So,
I think,
yeah, you know, so
I think students,
that's why I think it can't just be a quantum mechanical.
if I may, no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
A recommendation to students who are interested in philosophy or theology. I think there's very good work to be done in understanding quantum mechanics.
Right. It's a tough one.
It's probably the easiest. Well, I wonder, but I'm not sure you can...
And how you get from the quantum mechanical world, which seems so strange and so different from our world, to the world we actually experience.
No, that's right.
But
I really don't
it-
think we understand it.
I agree, but don't you think it's something that you might want to encourage people to study physics for?
That's what that's what
okay,
I
yeah,
said.
yeah,
You
yeah.
study quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah.
I'm sure my quantum mechanics class is very happy that you said that.
Any other questions from the panel? If not, I have one for Father Coyne from the internet, and I think it fits in with a lot of what we've heard the last 2 days. Why do we look so insignificant on the scale of the universe if Christian tradition is correct? Are we special to God?
Don't know. Have no idea. I mean, that leads into all, are there other spiritual beings? Let me use that word here because being intelligent is not enough. God loved us. We love God in my tradition. Are there Martians or Europans or not Europeans, Europans?
But of course, in conventional Christian theology, we are very special, right?
Yeah.
So you would be an exception, I would
but
say.
God
So he's a
spoke.
Jesuit.
Yeah, but
I agree, Alex, but the point is God spoke to us. Our knowledge is anthropocentric. We don't know what God said to any other people, if there are other people. So it's necessary that we're special to God. How could it be otherwise? We're the top of the heap on the earth, as best we know.
By the way, isn't it true that Lemaitre was a Jesuit?
No, he is accused of being one.
So,
Yeah.
in some sense, the founder of Big Bang cosmology was a Jesuit, in fact.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and
So-
George knows the story too. But he also chastised the Pope when Pius tried to do exactly
I
what he
referred
said.
to it in my talk, but you bring up a very important point, Frank, about Lemaitre. He wrote Primeval Adam, but at that time there were no data.
Yeah.
Okay, it was a pure intuition kind of thing.
So-
and Pius XII, heard about it and gave a talk about, that scientists are beginning to find what we know from Scripture about fiat lux, let there be light. God, yeah. And Lemaitre was president of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences at the time, so he had a way of getting to see the Pope, and he told them, Your Holiness, you may be infallible, but you're wrong.
Yeah, he told him to stop saying it, and he did stop saying it.
I like that. That's a good example of complementarity.
I've got one more question from the internet. Father Coyne, assuming we live in a universe which is part of a multiverse, how does the concept of God change or not change? Is the God of our universe the same as every other's? How would you address this theologically?
Again, I have to say I don't know because I have no knowledge of are there other universes or a multiverse. And I don't have any idea of how God would relate to them, if at all. I only know how God relates to me, that is, to us. That's all I know. My knowledge is really very limited. It provokes kind of thinking, but God's love for us was a completely, this is religious faith now, completely free gift of God. He needn't have loved us. He needn't have saved us because we revolted against God, as Scripture records it.
I thought I was going to say in the end that I agreed with absolutely everything you said in that sentence about. I would agree when it related to the multiverse and everything you said, except you added us instead of me. I think all you know is God's relationship to you. You don't know God's relationship to us, and you don't know God's relationship to me.
I certainly do not, but I do to the worshiping community that I've joined.
Oh, okay.
It's not God talking just to me. He's talking to a community of believers.
Yeah.
If I might add one thing, Frank's comment brought to mind in thinking about this. So this is a question I think a number of us have to confront, but you more often than most of us.
I guess so.
Lawrence. But, you know, to me, it's always been very interesting that when I think of my physics heroes, there are three of them that we all can name, Newton, Einstein, and Maxwell. In some sense, those are, I would personally submit, those might be the greatest physicists in history.
I get Galileo, but anyway.
Well,
anyway,
he was
doesn't
kind
matter.
of the
Doesn't matter.
granddad. Okay, but let's talk about, okay. But of the three of them, if you ask about their religious beliefs, it's what you get back is very interesting. And you probably know this better than I do.
Yeah, maybe.
But maybe perhaps some of the audience might benefit from this. If you look at Newton, the father of physics, he, although a Christian technically, his beliefs were rather unconventional in terms of Christian belief.
Yeah.
Maxwell, who sits between Einstein and Newton, was in fact a traditional Christian in his belief system. And then finally you come to Einstein, and who knows where he was at the end of the day, right? So I always take it away that these people, and then if we include Galileo, because we can't include Galileo in this, if we look at the people who in some sense were our prime initiators, what you don't find among any of them is, at least in my reading, I don't see an active opposition to faith.
Well,
No, but
let's. I think it's unfair.
Dirac was very...
I didn't include Dirac.
Yeah, well,
No,
no, but I
Dirac
think,
is almost in that category, if not actually in that category.
Yeah.
And he was quite an atheist.
Yes.
But the point is, I think the point is, I mean, while from a historical perspective interesting, in a general intellectual sense, it isn't. What scientists believe outside of science, first of all, is irrelevant. They're human beings. That some of them may be Republicans. But the key point is, I also get a little upset when people say, look at all the traditional scientists, and I know George hasn't, they were all Christian in our tradition. And the answer is, of course they were. It was the only game in town, it was the National Science Foundation of the 15th century, 16th century. If you weren't Christian, you wouldn't be at a university, you wouldn't be educated, you wouldn't be, so it's not very surprising. It's a historical fact, but there are historical arguments for it. It says nothing beyond that. And it is intriguing, of course, that these questions are so vague and diverse that scientists can have many different opinions on them, but they can have many different opinions about everything but science, and their opinions about anything but science are only as relevant as anyone else's.
Yeah, but the accomplishments of these individuals suggest that they might have spent some time thinking very, very deeply about these questions.
Well, as you point out, though, that Newton was absolutely a lunatic. He was...
Well, as I said, he was not traditional. We get Trinitarian. I mean, people should go read about Newton.
And I think most accurately, Einstein's God was the God of the universe, the laws of physics, Spinoza's God.
But Einstein,
he was not a deeply religious person in the classical conventional sense.
But more than that, he spoke out aggressively as Richard Dawkins would, against a personal God.
Yes, against a personal God.
He ridiculed it. No, so it's important to realize that. Yeah.
I know, but that's, in fact, not, well...
Yeah, but I agree with you. In a vague sense, he was the God of Spinoza, absolutely. He said it.
He said it directly.
Yeah, he said it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've been given this signal, and I regret to say that I'm going to have to call to a close the best Q&A session I've ever heard at a Nobel Conference. But we will close this session and reconvene at 6:30 for the Nobel Conference banquet in the Evelyn Young Dining Room, and look forward to seeing you there.